Clutter isn't just clutter, it's a silent thief. It steals your space, your peace of mind, and sometimes even your safety. After 60, the things we keep matter more than ever. A crooked rug can become a fall. A drawer full of maybe someday items can quietly drag us backward. But here's the truth that's hardest to face. It's not what you're holding onto, it's what's holding you back. In this video, we'll explore 7 ruthless decluttering rules every senior must know before it's too late. These aren't just tips, they're wake-up calls. So tell me honestly, is your home lifting you up or quietly weighing you down? Let's begin. She didn't need a bigger house, that much was clear. What Margaret needed, though she didn't know it yet, was less inside it. Less to walk around, less to trip over, less to hold her back. It happened on a quiet Thursday evening in early spring. She just folded the last load of laundry, warm towels balanced in her arms, and was making her usual path from the hallway to the bedroom. She didn't see the little footstool tucked just beyond the doorway, a stool she once used to slip on her shoes, now long forgotten in the shadows. Her toe caught, the towels flew, and then the hard thud of her body on the floor. Pain pulsed through her wrist, her hip screamed, and for a few moments she just lay there, half in shock, half in disbelief. It wasn't the first time Margaret had stumbled over something in her house, but it was the first time she couldn't get up without help. That night, the neighbor boy found her after she didn't answer the phone. The ambulance came. 6 weeks of recovery followed. Physical therapy, ice packs, sleepless nights. And in those nights, as she sat awake in her recliner with her arm in a sling, she started to look around differently. Her home, the one she and her late husband had bought in 1973, raised 2 boys in, celebrated anniversaries and ordinary Tuesdays in, suddenly felt different, not warm, not welcoming, but cluttered, heavy. Claustrophobic, there were stacks of magazines near the fireplace, 3 baskets by the back door, one for shoes, one for mail, one that held she didn't even know what, a leaning lamp she never turned on. Shelves of dusty books she never read, a drawer that hadn't been opened in years. All of it seemed to whisper, not in anger but with quiet weight, "You've been walking through yesterday for far too long." At first, she resisted that thought. These weren't obstacles, they were memories, souvenirs, the ordinary layers of a long life. But then she remembered the moment her wrist hit the hardwood, the way the stool seemed to leap into her path, and how easily it could have been worse. A broken hip, a cracked head, that's when it hit her. Clutter isn't just mess, it's a thief in disguise. It doesn't just take space, it takes time, it takes safety, it takes mental peace. And sometimes it steals quietly, so gradually you don't even notice it's gone. One item here, another there, until your body must twist and dodge to move through your own kitchen. Until the thought of finding something in the closet makes your chest tighten. Until the home you once cherished begins to feel like a trap. Margaret had always thought of her house as her anchor, but now she realized it had become a maze. A maze of yesterday's good intentions, yesterday's hobbies, yesterday's identity, and every object, no matter how small, carried weight. Some carried memories, some carried guilt, but almost none were helping her move forward. She sat by the window a few days later, sunlight spilling over a pile of unopened mail, and asked herself a hard question. When did my home stop serving me and start surrounding me? The silence answered back. So she started small. She made a list, not of what to throw away, but of what she wanted to be able to do freely again: walk from bedroom to porch without dodging baskets, open the pantry without ducking, sit at her favorite chair without shifting piles. It wasn't about cleanliness, it was about liberation. So now let me ask you, what's one item in your home that you've tripped over or always step around or never touch but never move? Is it still serving you or silently standing in your way? Margaret didn't need a bigger home, she needed a lighter one. And the first thing she had to let go of wasn't furniture, it was denial. Once Margaret accepted that clutter could steal her peace and even her safety, she began to see it everywhere. Not just in the things she tripped over, but in the quiet corners of her home. The back of the pantry, the bottom drawer of her buffet. The bins in the garage she hadn't opened in years. That's when she found them: 4 crockpots, all different sizes. One still had a clearance tag dangling from the handle. She stood there holding it like a stranger, wondering, when did I even buy this? She chuckled but then frowned. Somewhere between the Thanksgiving that never happened and the church potluck she never hosted, she'd convinced herself she needed extras. Just in case, she had whispered to herself year after year. A fondue pot in case the grandkids wanted something fun. Extra jackets 2 sizes too small in case she lost weight. Dozens of plastic containers in case someone needed leftovers. A sewing machine that hadn't been touched in 20 years just in case retirement brought inspiration. It never did. At first glance, these things didn't seem like clutter. They were neatly stored, tucked away, harmless. But they weren't harmless at all. They were a constant weight. Each one a silent reminder of something that never happened, of who she thought she might be, of a future that never quite arrived. Every time she opened a cabinet or walked past a closed closet, they spoke to her not loudly but persistently. You should use me, you might need me, what if? Margaret didn't realize it, but she was living in a house full of maybes. And maybes are exhausting. They take up more than space. They take up brain power. Every item had to be remembered, managed, occasionally cleaned, or shuffled around to make space for something else. It was like hosting guests who never said thank you, never helped with dishes, and never left. That's when her daughter gently offered a rule Margaret hadn't heard before. If you haven't used it in the past year, chances are you won't in the next one. At first, Margaret bristled. That felt harsh. Life was unpredictable. What if the power went out and she needed that old lantern? But the more she thought about it, the more the rule made sense. In 12 months, there had been birthdays, holidays, storms, and ordinary days. None of those things had come off the shelf, so she sat down with a cup of tea, pulled out a notepad, and did a small exercise. She chose 3 items she had kept just in case. An unopened emergency radio she bought during the blizzard of '98, a cardigan that still had the tag, a food dehydrator still in the box bought during her back-to-the-earth phase that lasted less than a week. Then she asked herself the question her daughter had written at the top of the page, would I buy this again today? It was simple and revealing. No, she wouldn't buy any of them, not even on sale. That question became her compass. As she moved from room to room, it helped her untangle what she truly needed from what she was simply afraid to part with. And that fear, it wasn't always about the object. Sometimes it was fear of waste, sometimes guilt. But often, it was fear of regret. What if she needed it the day after she gave it away? What if the neighbor asked for it? What if letting go meant admitting she'd never become the version of herself she imagined? But Margaret slowly realized that holding on to clutter wouldn't make those futures real. It only held her in place, paralyzed in a life she wasn't living. She didn't have to throw away everything at once, but she did have to be honest. And honesty asked harder questions than fear ever did. So let me ask you, what's hiding in your closet just in case? A dusty pan, a stack of clothes, a gadget you meant to use 5 birthdays ago. What would actually happen if you let it go? Because sometimes what we fear isn't the loss of the object. It's the loss of who we hoped we'd be, but not all clutter is loud or obvious. Some of it hides in boxes that haven't been opened in decades, stored quietly in closets or pushed to the back of shelves, waiting not to be used but to be remembered. That's what Margaret discovered one rainy afternoon when she decided to tackle the old wooden trunk in her bedroom. She hadn't looked inside since the year after her husband passed. She told herself she'd get to it eventually. But 17 years had gone by and the lid still hadn't been lifted. She opened it slowly, the hinges creaking like a memory waking up. Inside, everything smelled faintly of cedar and thyme. There were stacks of old birthday cards, a half-filled crossword book, and near the bottom, folded neatly and still holding its shape, a red and navy flannel jacket, her husband's favorite. The one he wore every fall, especially on those early mornings when he walked their boys to the school bus or raked the leaves before breakfast. Margaret lifted it carefully and laid it across her lap. It was heavier than she remembered. Not just in weight, but in emotion. She held it there for a long time. Her fingers ran along the cuff where it had frayed, where he used to tug at the sleeve when he was thinking. She could almost see him in it, standing by the back porch, coffee in hand, smiling that quiet smile of his. And just like that, the years vanished. She wasn't in her quiet house on a rainy Tuesday. She was back in the kitchen 30 years ago, watching him shrug it on before heading out. It hurt, and it comforted her at the same time. That's when she realized she hadn't been keeping the jacket because it was useful. She hadn't even looked at it in over a decade. She kept it because part of her believed that if she let go of it, she might lose him all over again, but holding on to that jacket hadn't brought him back. It hadn't kept her closer to him, it had simply sat in a box hidden in the dark while her life quietly moved on without it. She looked around her room and thought, love doesn't live in boxes. It lives in the stories we tell, the values we pass down, the way we laugh at the same old jokes. And that jacket, while filled with memories, deserved more than storage, so she did something different. The next morning, while the light was still soft, she laid the flannel out on the kitchen table and took a photo. Just the jacket, just the morning light. Then she sat with a pen and wrote, "He wore this every fall. It still smells like coffee and maple leaves. He taught our sons how to rake and how to rest. And I loved him most in this jacket because he never tried to be more than he was." She slipped the photo into a small album she'd started that week, a new kind of memory book. No clutter, just meaning. And then she called her grandson, now 15, who had just joined his school's baseball team. She told him about the jacket, what it meant, and asked if he wanted it. He said yes without hesitation. Watching him wear it that weekend, sleeves too long and collar a little big, Margaret didn't feel sadness. She felt pride. And peace. That flannel wasn't just a relic anymore, it was alive again, moving forward, not locked in a box. Because the truth is, letting go isn't forgetting, it's making space for new meaning. You don't have to keep everything to remember something, you can honor a memory without holding onto its object. And sometimes, the act of passing it on gives it more life than keeping it ever did. So I'll ask you gently, what's the one thing in your home you've kept, not because you use it, but because you're scared that without it, the memory might fade? Because love doesn't live in the drawer, it lives in you. Memories may live in the heart, but the body still lives in the present. And Margaret's body was the one reminding her that even the most sentimental home can become quietly dangerous. It happened again not long after she gave away her husband's flannel. This time it wasn't an old jacket or a crockpot. It was the dark, the kind that falls quick and heavy when a storm knocks out the power and every corner turns unfamiliar. She had gone to the kitchen for a flashlight. Her feet knew the path by memory, or so she thought. But just as she stepped into the hallway, her sock caught on the edge of a woven rug, the same rug that had been there for 15 years. The same rug that had curled at one corner years ago and never quite flattened again. In the dim light, she didn't see it. Her foot slipped, her hip slammed into the floor, and the side of her face grazed the wall. It wasn't a serious injury this time, thank God, a bruise, a scare, but it was enough to remind her, comfort can become carelessness. That night, sitting on the edge of her bed with an ice pack on her hip, Margaret looked around and noticed things she had stopped seeing. A stack of books near the nightstand, a laundry basket tucked beside the bathroom door, a stool she no longer used still sitting by the entryway. Her cozy little home had slowly turned into an obstacle course, one she navigated out of habit until habit failed her. She thought of all the places she had moved around in the dark or with a half-distracted mind. And she realized that as her eyes aged and her balance changed, the margin for error had become slimmer. What used to be charming clutter had become silent threats. The next morning, her daughter came over with coffee and gentle insistence. Together, they walked through the house with a flashlight as if they were preparing for a fire drill. "Let's pretend you have 5 seconds to get from your bedroom to the front door," her daughter said. "What's in your way?" It was a humbling exercise, the hallway bookshelf which leaned slightly into the path, a coat rack that wobbled when touched, a standing lamp that teetered more than it glowed. They cleared walkways. They swapped out a loose throw rug for one with a rubber grip. They added brighter bulbs in the hallway and nightlights near every doorway. It wasn't a renovation. It was a rescue. Margaret began to understand something most people over 60 rarely want to admit. It's not weakness to make your home safer. It's wisdom. It's love for yourself, for your children, for the years ahead. And it doesn't take a remodel, just a few clear steps, 15 minutes with a flashlight, a friend to point out what you no longer notice, a willingness to ask, if I had to leave this house in a hurry, would I trip on the way out? She even added a small rail by the porch steps, not because she needed it yet, but because she didn't want to wait until she did. For the first time in years, Margaret could walk from her bed to her front door without adjusting her stride. Without sidestepping shoes or squeezing past furniture. And that freedom, it felt bigger than the house itself. So let me ask you, have you walked your own home lately with safety in mind? Not for how it looks, but for how it feels to move through it. Take 15 minutes this week, turn on your flashlight, clear the path from your bedroom to your front door, then ask yourself, what in this space protects me? And what might be quietly putting me at risk? Because sometimes the things that blend in the most are the very ones that catch us off guard. But not all the clutter in Margaret's home belonged to her. Some of it had names and dates, ribbons, jerseys, posters from old rock bands. It lived in bins in boxes up in the attic, untouched for years. And for a long time she believed she was doing something loving by keeping it all. Her sons, trophies from high school, a worn teddy bear missing one eye, tiny shoes from when her daughter took her first steps. She held on to them because what if the kids wanted them back one day? It wasn't hoarding, she told herself. It was preserving, protecting memories just in case they ever asked. But the years went by, the boxes stayed sealed. The children got married, had their own homes, their own storage. Still, Margaret kept everything. Every time she thought of clearing it out, a little voice inside her whispered, what if they ask for it next year? So she left it. For a decade, then another. One Sunday her daughter came over for coffee. Margaret mentioned the attic, how it was getting too full, how she was thinking about organizing it. She smiled nervously and said, there's still a lot of your things up there. I figured you'd want them someday. Her daughter didn't laugh. She didn't look annoyed, she just leaned in gently and said, Mom, if I wanted them, I would have taken them. It hit Margaret like a soft but honest wind, not harsh but direct. Her daughter wasn't asking her to preserve the past. She was quietly moving on from it, and Margaret, without meaning to, had been carrying the weight for both of them. Later that week, she went up to the attic alone. The air was dusty and still. She opened one of the bins. Inside were yearbooks, crumpled birthday cards, a varsity jacket, and a box of medals from a spelling bee in 1993. She smiled, even laughed, but she also felt a strange kind of heaviness. Because she realized these things didn't belong to her anymore, and maybe they never really did. That afternoon, she made 3 piles: keep, ask, and let go. She texted her kids, going through the attic. If you want anything, let me know by Sunday, otherwise I'll be donating what's left. One replied with a thumbs up, another asked for a photo of the old baseball glove. No one panicked, no one asked her to hold on to everything. And something strange happened. With every item she released, Margaret felt a little lighter, not because she disliked the memories, but because they had done their job. Those little shoes had walked, the trophies had been held. The jacket had kept someone warm, they had lived their stories, and now it was time to make room for hers. She whispered to herself as she closed another box, I'm not throwing things away, I'm letting go to make space for both of us. Because here's the quiet truth no one tells you, when we keep things for others long after those others have moved on, we're not preserving memories, we're preserving responsibility. And sometimes that responsibility isn't real, it's guilt. It's the fear of being careless, but holding onto someone's old t-shirt won't bring them closer, and letting it go doesn't push them away. So let me ask you, are there items in your home you're keeping for your kids, your grandkids, or someone else who never asked you to, things they've already outgrown or forgotten? What would it feel like to finally pass that responsibility back and reclaim the space for yourself? Because sometimes the most loving thing you can do is let go. But even when Margaret stopped keeping things for her children, she noticed something else, something heavier. Not in the attic, not in a box labeled memories, but in a hallway drawer. It was the one next to the phone charger, stuffed with old receipts, dried pens, a sewing kit still sealed in plastic, and a half-used journal she'd bought 5 years ago. She hadn't touched that drawer in ages. And yet, every time she walked past it, she felt something stir in her chest. A quiet little ache, not sadness, guilt, the same guilt whispered from the treadmill in her bedroom. She had bought it 3 Christmases after her husband passed. It was expensive, the kind with heart monitors and an incline button she never learned to use. For a month, she tried, then her knee gave out, then the weather warmed, then she told herself, I'll start again in the fall. But seasons came and went, and there it sat like a monument to broken promises. She couldn't bear to give it away. It felt like admitting defeat. And then there were the books, stacks she'd picked up at garage sales, paperbacks with titles like French Cooking in 30 Minutes and You Too Can Learn Watercolors. All still unopened, all once carried with good intentions, and every time she dusted them that old whisper would return, "You should have read that, you meant to finish this, why haven't you?" One evening, Margaret sat in her recliner and stared at the bookshelf, at the drawer, at the treadmill, and finally said out loud, "I'm tired of feeling bad in my own house." She wasn't angry, just done. That night, she opened the drawer and pulled out the sewing kit. It still had the price sticker on it. Without much thought, she walked next door and knocked on Ruthie's door, her neighbor who just started a quilting group. "Would you use this?" Margaret asked, almost embarrassed. Ruthie smiled wide and took it gently in both hands. "Actually, I could. My mother just passed and I've been working on a mourning shawl to wear at her service." Margaret blinked. "With your own hands?" she asked. Ruthie nodded. "It feels like the only way to stay close while letting her go." The next morning, Ruthie knocked on her door with a soft smile and held out a piece of folded gray fabric, hemmed with care. "I used your kit," she said. "It was exactly what I needed." Margaret took it in, her eyes filling unexpectedly, not with guilt this time, but with something gentler: release, grace, quiet healing. She closed the door and leaned against it, whispering, "I thought I failed, but maybe I just passed it on to where it mattered." Margaret realized something important: guilt is a feeling, not a purpose. And objects that carry guilt don't deserve a pedestal, they deserve permission to leave. The treadmill, she donated it to a local church that started a seniors' wellness room. The books. A young teacher picked them up at her garage sale with a huge smile. Every time she let something go, the weight lifted not from her hands but from her mind, because guilt doesn't belong in your living room or your closet or your drawer. It doesn't make you healthier, it doesn't make you smarter, it certainly doesn't make you happier. What it does is stop you from feeling at home in your own space. So if you're listening to this, I want to invite you to do something right now. Think of one thing in your home that you keep not because you love it or use it, but because you feel bad about not using it. Maybe it was a gift, maybe it was expensive, maybe it came with a dream you didn't quite follow through. Pick that item, sit with it. Then ask yourself gently, could it serve someone else better? Could letting it go be a way to bless, not betray, your original intent? You don't owe your belongings a promise you never made. You don't need to carry guilt into your next chapter. Margaret didn't lose her dignity by letting go. She gave someone else comfort and gained back her own joy. So tell me, what's one thing in your home that you keep out of guilt, not love? Because clearing the guilt might just be the most powerful kind of decluttering you'll ever do. Letting go of guilt made Margaret feel lighter, but when she looked around, she still felt stuck. Not emotionally, physically. There were too many drawers, too many closets, too many little piles in too many corners. The hallway still held a stack of shoe boxes. The guest room closet hadn't been opened in months. And every time she thought about sorting it all, her heart sank. It felt like trying to move a mountain with a teaspoon. "I don't know where to start," she finally admitted over the phone one morning. Her daughter didn't hesitate. "Don't start big, start small. One drawer, 15 minutes. Margaret blinked. "That's it." "Yep, set a timer. One drawer, don't clean the whole room, just do that, then stop." It sounded almost too simple. But that afternoon, she tried it. She picked the drawer in the kitchen, the one she always ignored. She set her phone timer, rolled up her sleeves, and focused. No distractions, no phone calls, no wandering into another room. 10 minutes in, beneath some old envelopes and a dried-up pen, she found something unexpected. A faded Polaroid photo of herself on her honeymoon, laughing at the edge of a lake, hair tangled in the wind. She hadn't seen that picture in years. For a moment, she just stared, then smiled, a real, quiet smile, the kind that starts somewhere deep inside. She placed it on the counter and whispered, "I remember her." And in 15 minutes, it was done. It wasn't dramatic. No angels sang, but it was the first drawer in years that closed without sticking. The sight of it neat, clean, and holding something meaningful instead of forgotten sparked something quiet inside her. So she tried again the next day, one shelf in the linen closet, then the bathroom cabinet, the corner of the coat closet. Bit by bit, she chipped away at the weight she'd once thought was permanent. By the end of the week, she had filled 3 donation bags, tossed 2 trash bins worth of junk, and for the first time in a long while, she could actually walk through her hallway without sidestepping a single thing. It didn't take hours. It didn't take a life coach, it took 15 minutes, repeated, with care. What Margaret didn't expect was how those small wins began to shift how she felt. She stood taller, she slept better. She even started humming again while folding laundry. It wasn't about the drawers, it was the momentum, the shift in her mind. Because each time she finished one task, no matter how small, it told her, I can do this. I'm not stuck. I'm moving forward, and when something felt doable, it became worth starting. She even bought a small kitchen timer and left it on the counter, a reminder that change didn't have to mean upheaval. It could mean 15 focused minutes with a drawer, a basket, a shelf. So now I want to ask you, what's one drawer in your home that makes you sigh every time you open it? One shelf you haven't touched since last Christmas? One corner you keep promising yourself you'll get to tomorrow? Don't try to fix the whole house, just start there. Today, set a timer, tell no one, play music or don't, but focus, 15 minutes, no more. And when the timer goes off, step back, breathe, look at what you've done, not what's left, just what is, because what you've done matters. It's the first brick in a new path, a path that doesn't overwhelm or demand perfection, just progress. Margaret didn't wait for motivation, she created it 15 minutes at a time, and yet, even with a lighter home, the biggest shift wasn't what she removed, it was what she rediscovered. But the real shift didn't happen when Margaret emptied drawers or cleared corners. It happened the afternoon she opened a cardboard box she hadn't touched in 12 years. It sat in the back of her hall closet underneath an old coat and behind a pile of wrapping paper. When she pulled it out, the label on top read "Office Last Day." She smiled. She remembered packing it the week she retired from her job as a secretary at the courthouse. At the time, she thought she'd reopen it once she set up a little desk at home, maybe do some volunteer typing. Maybe organize family records, but the desk never came, and the box had waited. Inside, she found her old nameplate, some dried pens, 2 notepads, and a red stapler she used to love. There was a tiny calculator with a sticky 3 key and a coffee mug that said, Queen of Filing. For a moment, she chuckled, then she sat very still because the box didn't just hold office supplies. It held her, the version of her that used to wake up at 6 a.m., put on slacks and head downtown. The version that kept color-coded folders, scheduled meetings, brought donuts on Fridays. She missed that version in a way, that rhythm. That purpose, that desk by the window, but as she looked down at the items in her lap, she heard herself whisper something she hadn't admitted out loud. I'm not that version of me anymore, not in a sad way, in a freeing way. She didn't need to keep these things to prove who she'd been. Her years of work had already left their mark in the people she helped, the coworkers who still sent cards, the habits that shaped her. That life was finished, honored, complete. It didn't need a shrine. In that moment, she saw her home differently. It wasn't just cluttered, it was frozen. A museum of old selves, the mom of toddlers, the court secretary, the scout leader, each season had left behind souvenirs. But her home wasn't meant to be a museum, it was meant to be a sanctuary, so she made a final rule for herself, one that felt more like a promise. From now on, I only keep what supports the life I live now. Not the life I once imagined, not the version I hope to return to, the life I have today. She stood up, walked the box to the donate pile, and felt her shoulders drop. The air in the room felt different. It wasn't just emptier. It was clearer. She rearranged her living room that weekend, moved her puzzle table near the fireplace, cleared space for her yoga mat by the window, filled a drawer with tea bags, crossword books, and letters from her grandchildren. This was who she was now, a woman who still woke early but didn't rush, who liked quiet mornings, who didn't file paperwork but still loved good pens and thoughtful lists. She even bought a small sign from the thrift store and hung it above the coat rack. It read, "This is not a storage unit, this is my home." So I'll ask you now, look around your space. What version of yourself is it built for? Does it reflect the person you were 10, 20, 40 years ago, or does it support who you are becoming? Because the truth is, the space you clear becomes the life you choose. It's not just about letting go, it's about making room. For rest, for joy, for who you are now. So what changed after all the clutter was gone? Everything, but not in the way Margaret expected. And in the quiet that followed after the last box had been given away, the final drawer neatly closed, Margaret didn't just see a tidier house. She felt something shift inside her. For the first time in years, her home wasn't echoing with old should-haves and might-stills. It felt lighter, calmer, more her. This wasn't just about decluttering. Margaret had released more than things. She had let go of decades of silent guilt, faded identities, and dreams that no longer fit. In their place, she found space, not just on shelves, but in her days, in her breath. In the way she walked through her home and didn't brace herself for a stumble, that space became clarity. And in that clarity, she remembered who she was, not just who she had been, because letting go isn't forgetting, it's honoring, it's saying, "Thank you for what you were, and now I'm ready for what's next." We don't owe our homes to our old stories. We don't owe our drawers to guilt. We owe ourselves peace, safety, joy, room to grow, even in our 70s, even in small ways. So if any part of this story spoke to your heart today, I'd love for you to like, subscribe, and maybe share it with a friend who's also ready to make space for herself. And in the comments below, tell us what's one item you're ready to release today. Maybe writing it down is your first step. Because sometimes the very first thing you let go of isn't an object, it's the weight of who you used to be.